Every time I get into speculation about the power of magic to revolutionize a fantasy world, there are two commonalities. One, when I do my deep dive spell analysis videos, I'm specifically working from a D&D context, which I admit is an outlier in the more general fantasy world. And two, people always suggest that there simply aren't enough spellcasters in any given D&D world to create the kind of broad, systematic changes that I tend to propose. The first point is fair enough. D&D styled worlds aren't for everyone. They tend towards high fantasy, superheroic fantasy, at least in modern editions. But in such worlds, saying that there aren't enough magically gifted people to go around, well, that I do take issue with. So, some ground rules. I won't just be tackling this from a Forgotten Realms perspective. I'll stay as setting neutral as possible while using official materials and simply examine the system's text. Also, I will be taking the most charitable or conservative estimates that I can reasonably justify. And where possible, I will try to avoid baseless speculation. Finally, I will be using the 5th edition of the rules as my primary reference point. They are the most recent and the most widely played version of the system, as well as just happening to be the version that I am most familiar with. So, let's get going. Firstly, let's look at the existence of species with innate magic. Most elves, Aasimar, gnomes, genasi, furbolgs, and tieflings, even some half-elves, are capable of natural spellcasting by virtue of their lineage, by the very text of the game. That may not be entirely fair though. Many people argue that player characters are a special category of creature, that only they are special or chosen enough to gain the full abilities of a player species. Thus, only vanishingly few Aasimar can produce magical light in these conditions. Very few forest gnomes are capable of conjuring a minor illusion, and most high elves don't succeed in their quest to acquire this culturally learned power in a similar way to how wizards learn magic, at least judging by the intelligence modifier requirement. And so most high elves don't have any sort of wizarding cantrip in their arsenal. Incidentally, the Forgotten Realms does do pretty much exactly this, only certain people have the gift. So, whatever dark entity you pray to cannot necessarily grant you innate personal power, but only use you as kind of a disposable conduit for its own magic. Frankly, I find this explanation disappointing and confusing. But I'm being as charitable as I possibly can, so let's say we're back to square one. Only the special chosen PCs actually benefit from the mechanics of their own heritage. Except by the text of the rules, that's not really true. What about Yuan Ti? They're perennial villains in many D&D products, but players can also choose to play as them in 5th edition. And they get magic. Specifically, poison spray and animal friendship, only the animal friendship only works on snakes. At 3rd level, they can also cast suggestion. But seeing as they're such common enemies, we can also see their stat blocks. A Yuan Ti pureblood, thus observed, has the ability to cast these exact same spells. Now, a critic of my perspective here would point out that this stat block represents the most combat ready of any Yuan Ti pureblood, and that even this enemy might be exceptional among its kind. This makes some degree of sense, but it is also true that every published Yuan Ti enemy type has the ability to at least cast a 2nd level spell. For example, the Fane of the Night Serpent from the Tomb of Annihilation adventure. Although it is set in the Forgotten Realms, it's about the best example we have of how a Yuan-Ti cultic society might be set up. It holds 25 purebloods, 25 brood guards, 15 Malisons, 3 priests, and a nightmare speaker. Even if we consider this to be a large colony of 69 Yuan-Ti, it is only around a third of them who can't cast spells using the NPC equivalent of second level spell slots. All I've really demonstrated so far is that in an exemplar society of monsters with innate magic, the majority will tend to have that innate magic. This makes a lot of sense in my mind, but it does also, at least to me, suggest that the majority of these player species who have access to innate magic should also probably be following the same rules. That at least a majority of them should have access to their innate magical abilities. Otherwise it would cease to be a heritage and turn into more of a rarity. So in theory then, at least the majority of high elves and high half-elves, there's got to be a better way of saying that, could have learned to cast prestidigitation. That's likely thousands and thousands of spellcasters reshaping civilization as we know it, if you've seen my video on that spell. Now, I'll admit it, this is speculative. Now, unfortunately, there is no official module that has us dive into fighting an entire forest gnome village, with every gnome being statted out as to what they can do, but I hope that you agree with me that a majority of them should reflect that species' innate ability to cast minor illusions. But okay, what about higher level magic? After all, in my last video, I implied that teleportation circles would significantly alter worldwide logistics. It is a 5th level spell, after all, meaning it's only available to 9th level full casters. Bards, sorcerers, and wizards, to be precise. At minimum, a teleportation circle costs 18,250 gold to set up, with a 50 gold use fee, and uses up a year of your court mage's time and 5th level spell slots, one every day. Is that worth it? Yep. A sailing ship costs 10,000 gold pieces to acquire in the base game, as well as additional upkeep and crewing costs. An ocean voyage could take a month or more both ways, so foreign commodities would be very, very difficult to acquire in the Age of Sail, for example, and impossible to get fresh. Unless there's a handy teleportation link between 2 places, or at least one close by to your second location. The moment goods are in hand, they're in their destination for 50 gold pieces and a spell slot. And you can fit a lot through a 10-foot diameter circle in 6 seconds if you've got enough men or beasts to carry it. But that's all beside the point. So why do I believe that there should be enough high-level spellcasters in the D&D world that magic is available to noble or royal courts with enough wealth and pull? Well, firstly, dedicating one's life to studying magic is expensive. So it stands to reason that, like Renaissance artists or classical composers, a patron relationship should develop, whereby wealthy folks sponsor the learning and study of mages. But a second reason that I believe this to be true is because, well, of the amount of formalized magic that exists right there in the rulebooks of 5th edition. There are 8 schools of magic in the classic categorization, which means 8 separate, or at least semi-independent magical study areas to choose from. And this is without even mentioning the various bard colleges, druidic circles, and faith practices which are bound to exist to create bards, druids, and clerics and paladins. Formalised learning and training are generally perceived as fairly necessary for many of these classes to do their jobs. On the wizard spell list specifically, there are over 300 levelled spells, from shield to weird. And by the game's own design, these are single expressions of magic for which specific actions and items must be used to create their effects. Unless every spell and gestures to cast it are gifted to the magical community by gods or powerful extraplaners, mages throughout history have to have been doing a lot of research to discover all of these spells. And no doubt, it is tough to find the right incantations, hand movements, and material components just to make yourself invisible. Who on earth is going to be the one to discover that you need specifically an eyelash encased in gum Arabic? So, it is my firm belief that even with the ability to ask the gods for hints and clues, the development and discovery of magical spell effects is a tough and involved process of continuous historic research. Wizards researching magic, especially in the early days, should be treated really as inventors are in our history, tinkering and working off of some basic first principles to make something new. I think it is reasonable to expect that a mage who invents a spell should be at least at the level with which they could cast the spell, if not higher. After all of this theory is supported by the phenomenon of named spells in D&D as well. Tasha, Tensor, and Bigby are all significant mages for the history of the game, sure, but in the rules text themselves they are called out as spell creators, inventors, and perfecters. So with all that said, why do I believe there should be so many powerful mages? Because someone discovered these 300 to 500 spells and how to cast them. Even if we assume that the average mage creates one new spell in their lifetime, which, to be honest, is a bold expectation, but does potentially account for someone discovering multiple spells at once, like Bigby in previous editions, we have, at my count, which may well be wrong, over 60 casters capable of inventing 5th level spells, 48 capable of inventing 6th level spells, 28 for 7th level spells, 24 for 8th level, and 22 for 9th level spells. Knocking a few off for mages creating similar spells at high level or having some significant obsession with hands, thank God it's not feet, like Bigby, we're still left with over 100 historic spell inventors, true masters of their magical schools in a world's history who were far beyond 9th level. 9th level wizards, by the way, not 9th level spells. And this, again, is assuming that the discovery of a new spell is relatively common. Besides, the number of super powerful magical artifacts, magically created species like golems or owlbears, and even the number of liches that exist in most traditional settings around the world hints at the inescapable truth. High-level magic is not that rare. Heck, many extraplanar entities can actually cast Wish and many more. Plane shift, from fairy godmothers to hags, genies and ancient dragons to devils. There are enough beings out there capable of casting a spell in Wish that makes the casting of any other spell under 9th level immediately possible. Goodness, a very rare magic item can be used to cast 7th level magic infinitely. The Amulet of the Plains. In a world where a deal with a devil is just a bad day away, where archfays can have ultimate control over vast swaths of reality, and where, using only a single sourcebook, you can fly to space on the whims of your own mind, suggesting that the material plane only has a few magical movers and shakers of interest requires significant extra justification. Is your world closed off almost entirely to extraplaners? Well, you're going to struggle to have warlocks. Is divine intervention limited or forbidden? Bye-bye some cleric features. I am fine with suggesting that even the most major of cities have perhaps just one wizard and their apprentice. But if they are the only people in the entire city capable of using magic, then a random nervous miscreant striking a deal with a hag might be all it takes to bring that city almost to its knees. If we assert that, as Ed Greenwood has intimated, you live in a world where only 1 in 40,000 denizens can utilise magic in any other way other than as a conduit for a higher power, blasting through you and destroying your body in the process, then, put simply, the vast and varied threats in the world that aren't considered people under this 40,000 rule develop a complete and total dominance. The same is true if class levels are limited to the rarefied few. A brave set of 3 to 5 heroes per country will fail to make a dent on the overwhelming supremacy of magical creatures in such a world. And after all that, even if you disagree with me on a fundamental level, I want you to consider the amount of magic-wielding people your parties have encountered as you've been running games. From introductory necromancer mini-boss to wise archmage. From the local caster of Identify to the healers stationed in a local temple. Sure, most will likely have been under 3rd level, but if the town of Riverford can sustain a healer, a local witch, and a necromancer nearby, then I'm sorry, but magic is more common than you want to admit in your setting. Or your D&D party is at the centre of the mother of all cosmic coincidences. Otherwise, if you're happy to be avoiding spellcasting enemies like the plague, go for it. But remember, a temple filled with yuan ti will end up with more spellcasters in it than your entire country. Go for it if magic is not considered a tactical advantage, but I would argue that suggestion, temporary limited mind control, is all you need to destabilise an unprepared or undefended city, economy, or even country. Finally, we should probably discuss magical casters who aren't wizards. I'd wager it's a reasonable suggestion that even with the crossover on spell lists, each spell probably needs to be discovered or at least first used in its own tradition, rather than just copied wholesale from the research the wizard has done. Discovery looks different to all classes, of course, none more so than the sorcerer, who might discover a new additional power simply through the self-improvement of his own natural magics. In this very vein, a druid and a wizard will very likely have very different methods and approaches to casting control winds, at least from a flavour perspective. But this is also, I admit, a slight tangent. We do need to talk about sorcerers and warlocks. Both follow a natural spell level progression, if not a traditional spell slot progression, and both entirely gain their powers from contact with the other. Whether you're touched by shadow, far realm madness, a devil, demon, or an old god, the caster's power is not limited by their willingness to learn, dedication to study, but simply by luck, aptitude, and natural charisma. Sorcerous bloodlines being a thing do imply families filled with magic users, and with the frequency that other planes cross with the material, errant magical energy may affect and imbue people with magic quite often. And this is all without mentioning the literally infinite amount of demons and thousands of devils whose entire job, when they're not fighting the blood war, the single most unnecessarily and stupidly contrived conflict in D&D's entire planar canon, is to tempt mortals to their side. In short, if your world is so filled with magic, a sapient creature will get their hands on it. Whether that's through dark dealings or draconic dalliances makes no matter. Magic is a real force in your world, and is the single greatest force for personal improvement in the world, excepting perhaps psionics, if you're using them, and you should. In at least some cases, it doesn't require years of back-breaking labour, or finding someone willing to train you in arms and armaments to become powerful. All you need is a bit of luck, a bit of natural skill, and an ally on the other side, and any serf can rise beyond their station, can throw off the chains of systematized oppression, and make their own way in the world, becoming stronger and more terrifying than those goblins who used to terrify them. Magic is an overwhelming force for growth, power, and change, and to deny that is to deny the foundational truths of the system of 5th edition. I mean, as one final point, there is not a single class in the game that is incapable of using leveled spells. The closest we get is, by my reckoning, barbarians, who can only usually cast some ritual spells. If many species, all classes, and so many of the monsters in your world, from the obvious kind of hags and liches to the less obvious magma mephits and burbelangs, can all cast spells, then I'm afraid your world, whether you like it or not, has a pretty large magical basis upon which to build. Of course, do what you will. Homebrew, tinker, and modify to your heart's content. But in my opinion, by its very nature, D&D 5th edition practically necessitates a high magic world from its very systemic roots. You can mitigate this, of course, but that does involve modifying the base truths of the game. And this finally allows me to return to my original point. In my videos, which speculatively analyse the impacts of certain rule systems from within D&D, I try to take the system as the base assumption. Rules as written, system as described. I work to consider the implications of things within the limits and assumptions of 5th edition's design. And at least in my opinion, and I hope I might have convinced you too, one of the core features of D&D 5th edition at least is a magically potent, a magically suffused world. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've appreciated this argument more so than a deep dive analysis. We'll be getting back into those soon, but I thought it very important to address this question, which has been one that kind of keeps cropping up and also is a huge source of debate on the internet. Yes, there are people who are seeking to do whatever they will with 5th edition's core systems, but at least in my view, it's quite difficult to justify taking 5th edition to a place that isn't high magic, at least. It's too baked into the core fantasy of the system. There are plenty of other systems out there, and I would love to at some point cover a few others. But for now, I've got my brain and my mind filled with all sorts of speculative thoughts. Maybe something to do with teleportation circle or plant growth in the future. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching. Tomorrow we're coming up on the year anniversary of my channel, which is awesome, and I'm so stoked to have so much support from the community. It's really been quite the wild ride, and I appreciate every single one of you who's stuck around, who's watched one video, who's subscribed to the channel. It's ridiculous, the growth and love and support that I've seen from this community. I appreciate it a lot. My name's Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next video.